Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. What I'm going to be doing in this video is explaining what I would consider to be the big problem or the big Achilles heel with secular humanism. And what I call this video is the question that secular humanism cannot answer. Now I do want to qualify this because while that's what I just titled this video, there may actually be an answer to this question. So I am open to being wrong about this. Obviously that's how we, should be. But hear me out, because the reason I titled the video not what Paul thinks is the big problem with secular humanism or something, is I'm going to explain what the issue is and then why I think secular humanism, especially under its naturalistic assumptions, cannot answer this question and why it's unable to. So that's why I'm not just saying, even though I'm not necessarily 100% convinced that I'm right, I do want to make the case for why I think it would be very challenging, why you're fighting an uphill battle to answer this question. And I have posed this question to secular humanists, and I haven't gotten really a satisfactory response. But that's not to say that such a satisfactory response doesn't exist. It's just, I think it has to do with the difficulty of the challenge itself. But once again, that's not necessarily an argument that there is never an answer. So I'm always open to there being an answer to this. But yeah, may not also be a real challenge. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get into it. The main question is, why is secular humanism true? And to make this claim, right? Why is secular humanism, which considers treating humans generally as equals and man is the measure of all things, kind of thing, why is this a true proposition or a true statement? And to illustrate this point, imagine a variant of secular humanism. What I'm going to do is call this white secular humanism, or WSH. And this is like secular humanism, except it only extends moral concern to white humans. It's not all humans of all races. It's just basically whites. It's like white supremacy, right? Now, that's not to say WSH or white secular humanism wouldn't extend any moral concern to people of other races. It's just maybe that's not its concern. Just in the same way that secular humanism probably extends some level of moral concern to other species, other types of animals like dogs and horses, but maybe not at the same level as humans per se. The question we need to ask is, why is secular humanism more correct, or SH, more correct than white secular humanism? Now, secular humanism seems to make the claim that a circle of moral concern that includes all humans is prescriptively correct or is right, and one that only selectively extends its circle of moral concerns to some humans is not correct. And I think they would make a good point that extending the circle of moral concern to some humans and not others is kind of like, it's bad logic, it's special pleading. But of course, then we can make the argument, well, why do this at the human level? Why not do this at, let's say, the species level or something like that? And I think this is where secular humanism runs into issues under naturalism. Why is it the case that secular humanism is somehow superior, and what are the reasons for this? Can you even provide coherent reasons under naturalism? With the question being, can a secular humanism give a white secular humanist a reason? And I'm not talking about just like, well, obviously this is true, but an actual rational reason grounded in fact, grounded in proof, grounded in evidence, and grounded in maybe scientific methodology, which we'll talk about in a minute, a reason to change their circle of moral concern, to say why they're wrong. And two of the reasons why this is such a big challenge for secular humanism are due to Hume's is-ought distinction and G.E. Moore's open question argument. So Hume's is-ought distinction basically says, science and the scientific method can tell us what exists around the world is a good method for finding reality, but it doesn't tell us how we ought to behave or how we should behave. And if secular humanism wants to claim that people ought to behave as if other humans are equal, it needs to be able to provide a reason to do that, and that reason is going to be very difficult to find with scientific methodology, perhaps impossible. G.E. Moore's open question argument is a very similar piece to Hume's is-ought distinction, and it basically makes a statement that you can't really reduce goodness to a natural property, because if you could, then you could just use that natural property in question. You could basically say, okay, well, goodness is just a stand-in for, human flourishing or something, and then you don't need to use the word good anymore. But it seems to be odd, because then it's like, well, what property is this level of goodness? So both of these things, I think, are kind of attacking the fundamental idea that we can find secular humanism's truth within scientific methodology. Now, here's kind of the issue here. Prescriptive moral claims favor a supernatural basis, and this comes right out of Hume's is-ought distinction. What scientific experiment could we do to basically falsify or find out whether or not secular humanism was true or false? Are we open to falsifying whether or not humans have any moral value at all? And if the answer to that is no, then we cannot claim that secular humanism is based on reason, truth, or the scientific method at all. And, put the same way, how do we get such a universal ought from naturalism itself, especially in naturalism that tries to claim that humans came about by this blind, unguided, uncaring process, and that's the cosmic universal reality. Yet somehow you ought to treat other people like they have some equal value to you, even though that equal value is kind of arbitrary, right? That's definitely not something you can just test. Where is the value in other humans? You can't just quantify such a value. And the burden of proof here is on the secular humanists to demonstrate how we can actually do this, where this ought actually comes from, because they're the ones basically claiming that such a thing is possible. And this is despite the fact that there's a lot of assent from many philosophers that finding such an ought in the premises of naturalism is basically impossible. So the burden of proof is on the secular humanists to demonstrate how one can do this. Once again, could we use the scientific method to falsify whether humanism is true or false? And if we can't, then I think we're left by admitting that secular humanism is arbitrary. And there's something very deeply unsettling about this, and yet that seems to be the situation that we're in. If we cannot falsify whether humanism is true or false, secular humanism itself fails to meet the requirements for knowledge under naturalism, and thus should be rejected like any other supernatural propositions that the secular humanist is going to reject, like God, spirits, anything beyond the natural world. Here's basically a quote from, I just got this right from secularhumanism.org. It says, secular humanism is philosophically naturalistic. It holds that reliable knowledge is best obtained when we query nature using the scientific method. Naturalism asserts that supernatural entities like God do not exist and warns us that knowledge gained without appeal to the natural world and without impartial review by multiple observers is unreliable. That seems to imply to me that secular humanism itself as a moral claim is unreliable, because that knowledge, how would we appeal the natural world to find knowledge that secular humanism is true? I don't think we can find it. And this isn't a controversial thing, actually. I'm not making a big claim here. The father of secular humanism, Paul Kurtz, he even made this claim, right? The central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundations. They are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent, i.e. supernatural ground. They are purely ephemeral. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but whatever, right? They're basically are beyond our ability to query it, which would seem to imply that under naturalism, secular humanism must admit that it's prescriptively arbitrary, which is, to me, deeply unsettling. Now, let's go into a couple possible answers, and I'm going to explain why I think they fail. The first one I think is pretty straightforward. It's basically evolutionists selected organisms who care about the propagation of the species, and therefore we ought to care about humans because we share DNA with humans, some sort of code. The first thing I want to say is group selection is controversial, and the vast majority of behavioral biologists are not convinced that group selection is a plausible mechanism of evolution. I have there's a book called Principles of Social Evolution. You can look into that, which makes that claim. I actually disagree with this quote. I think, yes, group selection is controversial. I agree with that. But I've read compelling arguments in favor of group selection that come from evolutionary arguments that make me think, okay, it's a little bit too early to tell. Sure, it's controversial. That doesn't mean we should necessarily support it, but that also doesn't mean it's not true either. We haven't necessarily proven that group selection can't happen. So I think the best thing to do is just remain open-minded about group selection. I'm actually, well, it doesn't matter what I think, but anyway, I would say let's not rule that out. But the main issue with this claim doesn't have nothing to do with group selection at all. It's that it falls into the naturalistic fallacy. It doesn't provide a reason for following it. Just because evolution has selected organisms who care about the propagation of species doesn't mean that I ought to follow evolution to do that. In fact, white secular humanism, as we described earlier, could make the argument that outgroup hostility and racism is natural too. That, they're just being racist, and that comes out of naturalism from tribal warfare or something. They could make an evolutionary argument the same way. And unfortunately, that would just bring us back to square one. We wouldn't be making any progress because both sides would be arguing that they are basically natural, and that, once again, doesn't provide us prescriptive reason. The next answer is obviously this is kind of ridiculous, but somebody could say, do we even need to care about this? Isn't this obvious? I feel like this doesn't even need to be addressed, but there are people who do make this argument, like Sam Harris makes this argument in The Moral Landscape. Well, what else could it be? Isn't it obvious? No, of course it's not obvious. We need to ask this question because there are plenty of people who do not care about human suffering, which means we need to be able to provide them a reason why their moral view is somehow wrong. And here's an example. When I see a bear eat a salmon, I don't feel the need to step in on the salmon's behalf because the salmon is outside of my circle of moral concern. If I was that salmon, I would certainly want somebody to step in and save me from this. So once again, secular humanism needs to give a reason for why humans matter in the grand scheme of moral concern, but somehow salmon doesn't. Which begs the question, is secular humanism prescriptively arbitrary? And I would argue under naturalism it is. What makes people different under naturalism? One of the ways you can basically consider this is you have this tree of species, this evolutionary tree with different species and all these different people. And secular humanism wants to draw the line right at the species level, not any lower at the racial or familial level, and not necessarily any higher at the species level. Otherwise, you would be obligated to step in on the salmon's behalf. And the question we can ask is, why? Does this even make sense under naturalism? Why is this true? But really the main issue with this is this doesn't qualify as an argument saying, isn't it obvious? Do we even need to care? Of course we need to care, right? This is bad logic and an argument from incredulity. You can't just say, well, it's obvious that it's the case or this must be the case. No, you need to be able to provide an actual reason why it's true for it to constitute an actual reason. The last way to do it is just to bite the bullet and say, yeah, it's arbitrary, but this is how I'm going to live my life. I'm a secular humanist. I feel like this is the way that things are, and we're just going to live our lives like this. And I respect this. I really do. I think this is the best you can do under naturalism. If you've decided you're a naturalist, I would much rather you be a secular humanist than a moral nihilist or something like that. And I really do think this is the best you can do. And if I was a naturalist, probably be the position I would take as well. The issue, and I'm not saying this has an issue, but the issue here is if you do accept that it's arbitrary, you now have the additional issue of why you should convince others to follow secular humanism. And this gets to be a little bit tricky. If secular human is not based on reason, truth, or the scientific method, which are the de facto standards for naturalism to find truth, then of course it's arbitrary. And as a result, this means you cannot give someone a good reason to follow it, which means if you're a secular humanist and you meet someone who's a white secular humanist and you've accepted that your secular humanism is prescriptively arbitrary, you're admitting that you cannot give the white secular humanist a reason to change their belief structure or their circle of moral concern to consider all humans or humans of all races. Now, why is this a problem? If you're changing someone's circle of moral concern under naturalism or under admitting that it's arbitrary, you're literally manipulating them. And the reason this comes down to manipulation is you can't give them an actual reason to change their behavior in accordance with what is reality because there are no such reasons. So you literally have to just change their behavior according to principles that you don't believe are true or exist as knowledge or just exist at all, which means you're basically trying to change their behavior or the way they live their lives in accordance with what feels good to you, but it's not based in reality or truth, which once again, there's something that's just so unsatisfying about this. But once again, I think this is the best you can do. And you can go even farther and say under these sorts of assumptions, people are always means to your own ends, because trying to convince someone that their metaethical view is wrong without believing that there is such a thing as metaethical truth or that secular humanism is somehow prescriptively correct means you are just using them as means to your own ends because you cannot give them an actual reason. You cannot provide or demonstrate them an evidence-based reason for this. So what do you think? I'd really like to hear from other secular humanists, how you'd approach this, if you have any responses. Am I wrong? How would you challenge me on this? Really like to know. Really like to know. Thanks you guys for watching. A few more resources that I think are worth mentioning. I do have a paper. I'll put a link in here for more detailed exploration of this. Once again, this is forthcoming in a metaethics journal /workshop. So that'll be coming, but the draft is on Phil Papers. So you can take a look at that. Really influential paper is G.E.M. Ascombe's Modern Moral Philosophy. She wrote this paper, I think, in the 50s, and really influential paper. It's the first paper that coined the term consequentialism, and definitely worth your read, which that book inspired Alasdair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue. It's a great book. It's a little dense, but it's definitely worth your time reading. Really fantastic book. And then other work kind of on similar sorts of arguments and things. I would say those are probably the best, but you can also look into Richard Joyce's work. Not that these are somehow worse, but those are the most relevant. But Richard Joyce's work, The Myth of Morality, The Evolution of Morality, which draws upon J.L. Mackie's work. And then Kai Neilson also has some stuff. He's a book, I think Kai Neilson has Ethics Without God. Really interesting book. I ended up, even though obviously I'm not an atheist, I ended up agreeing with a lot of Kai Neilson's points, or definitely assenting to some of the things he was saying too. So all of those are worth your time. All of these people and authors are worth your time reading. Check it out. Anyway, thanks for watching, and let me know what you think. See ya.